Okay, and so this is our fourth and final lesson here in our first unit of this background knowledge, and it's the anatomy of the Texas State Constitution. It is lesson 4. So our objectives are to analyze issues, policies, and political culture in Texas, which has been ongoing. We're going to explain the origin and development of the Texas Constitution, which also has been ongoing. And we're going to get a little bit more in depth into these separation of powers and checks and balances in both theory and practice in Texas. And so our essential questions are what type of political culture typifies Texas? Number 2, what elements or events affected the development of the Texas Constitution? Or number 3, in theory, what are the ideas of separation of powers and checks and balances, and how do they work in government? So a little background information on the Texas State Constitution. We know that it was written and ratified in 1875-1876, ratified in 1876. It contains 17 articles, some of which will mirror the federal constitutions. We're going to see some overlapping characteristics. It has a preamble as well as an appendix. And folks, this constitution contained nearly 87,000 words, right? It is very exhaustive, it is very in-depth, and it is extremely detailed. And if we think about our political culture, our individualistic and traditionalistic political culture, and our distrust or mistrust of a centralized government or a government period, then we know why it is 87,000 words. And it is because they wanted to be very explicit as to what the government could and could not do. And so this Texas State Constitution is the second longest constitution of the 50 states. The longest constitution would be Alabama's, and they have a whopping 388,000 words in their constitution. Now, just to give you a little bit of understanding as to exactly how long these constitutions are, if we look at the U.S. Constitution, it is 4,543 words. And if you include these 27 amendments, it is 7,591 words. And so we can kind of infer, based upon these numbers, that the Texas State Constitution is very specific as to what the government can do, whereas the federal Constitution is much more implicit. There's much more implied powers that go on. And so there's probably a little bit more rigidity in our Texas State Constitution than there would be in our federal Constitution. All right, so let's look at our some important articles. We won't go through every one of the articles, all 17, because they're I hate to say that they don't matter, but some of them matter more than others. And so if we look at the first article, this is our Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights, there is some overlap between the federal Constitution and the state Constitution because they do protect speech, religion, rights of the accused. They also guarantee the writ of habeas corpus, meaning they can't just put you in jail for no reason. You have to be charged of something. There is equality based on sex, race, color, creed, or national origin, and that was officially inserted into the Constitution, into the Bill of Rights in 1972. And some other things that are included in our Constitution. In 2005, there was a constitutional amendment that was passed that defined marriage as between a man and a woman. So it essentially banned gay marriage in Texas beginning in 2005. But Obergefell versus, I forget the name of the Supreme Court decision, but in 2015, it is going to be struck down by the Supreme Court. And so even though it was in the Constitution, it will be declared null and void by this Supreme Court decision, because the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what the Constitution means. And if there is a law that is passed by a state that essentially tries to supersede a national directive or national law or national Supreme Court decision, then because of the supremacy clause of the Constitution, the national level is going to trump the state level. Article 2 is going to essentially outline the powers of the government, and there are significant separations of powers. between the different branches of government. There are some very explicit checks on the powers of government between the three branches rather than the more implied checks in the U.S. Constitution. And while we will get into that a little bit later, we're not going to go too in depth right now. As we start looking at the individual branches of government in the Texas in our Texas Constitution, we will start looking at these checks and balances, these more explicit checks and balances more and more. So just suffice to know now that there is significant separation of powers of the government that are much more explicitly written than those that are in the federal Constitution. Article 3. Article 3 is going to establish the legislative department. It creates a bicameral legislature, meaning if you've had federal government before, or if you just know this, the bicameral legislature means there are two different chambers within the legislature. And very much like the federal level, we have a House of Representatives, and there are 150 members in the House of Representatives, and we have the Senate, and there are 31 Senate members. This article also specifies the requirements for office, and when we start talking about the legislative branch in depth, we will go into the specific requirements in order to run for office. It establishes our congressional term, which is really fascinating to take Texas government during a congressional, when Congress is in session in Texas, because it's only a part-time legislature, and it does not meet every year. It meets every other year on an odd-numbered year. So it establishes that congressional term meets 140 days every 2 years. Also, this idea of a mistrust of government, we don't need them in office constantly making laws. Let's limit them to 140 days every couple of years. It's called the biennium. And so this Article 3 will establish the congressional term. And then it also gives the salary for Congress. And if you want to be a wealthy politician, you're going to need to seek wealth elsewhere, because in Texas, we have part-time politicians, and the legislature does not get paid very much at all. You get paid $600 a month, and then when you are in session, you get a per diem, X amount of dollars per day while you are in session. And so you're not going to get wealthy being a legislator in Texas. And that's probably by design. It's another limitation on the powers of individuals that hold those offices. Again, I can't stress this enough. As we move forward, we start looking at each of these departments specifically. We're going to have an entire unit on the legislature, an entire unit on the executive, an entire unit on the judiciary. We'll start delving into these things a little bit more in depth. Article 4 creates the executive department. And our executive department is made up of a bunch of individuals, and it's made up of the governor, the lieutenant governor, the comptroller of public accounts, the commissioner of the general land office, and the attorney general. All of these individuals are elected, and they are elected separately, right? So if we compare this to the federal level, at the executive department, the federal level, you have the president, the vice president, secretary of the treasury, Attorney General, Secretary of the Interior, probably. These individuals are going to be appointed by the president. They're cabinet departments that are appointed by the president. In Texas, we don't do that. In Texas, the lieutenant governor runs for the governor runs for office. The lieutenant governor runs for office. The comptroller of public accounts runs for office, etc. They're all elected in separate elections. They do not run on the same ticket. I mean, they do not run on in the same election. Now, in Texas, because we have been dominated by one political party for a lot of years, all of the individuals in this department are Republicans. However, it is possible, theoretically, that you could have a governor of one political party partnered with a lieutenant governor of another political party, right? So you could have a mixture of different political parties that fill these different positions, because they are all elected separately. Okay, this is called a plural executive, which you will hear again as we move forward. There's also the Secretary of State as in the executive department, and they are the only position in the executive department there that are appointed by the government. It sets the term of the governor of all these individuals that are elected to terms of 4 years. Previously, up until I believe the 1970s, and I don't know the date right off the top of my head, but I will find out, the Texas governor and all those individuals that were elected served 2-year terms, right? And so it's kind of harkens back to that idea of mistrust of government. We're going to limit them specifically. But then that is going to be changed as we got into more modern history, and we'll be looking at that a little bit more in depth a little later. It also sets the salary, and it also resets the responsibilities of the governor. One of his responsibilities is that he can call a special session of Congress if he deems it necessary to the well-being of our state. And so, again, we'll delve more in depth on these as we move forward. Article 5 creates the judicial department, and unlike the federal level where we have one high court, the Supreme Court, in Texas we actually have 2 high courts. We have the Supreme Court, who deals with civil cases, and then we have the Court of Criminal Appeals, who deal with the criminal cases. And so we have a couple of different high courts that deal with different areas of the law. The legislature reserves the right to create other courts as they see fit, and they have done that over the course of Texas history. It also establishes the requirements for state judges, and it establishes the election of state judges, which is also a departure from the norm at the federal level, because at the federal level, state judges are going to be appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. But in Texas, we elect our judges, right? They're not appointed, and they are elected, and they have to run for re-election. And so there is some argument as to whether or not this is a good thing or if this is a bad thing, and we'll get more into that as we move forward. But suffice to say for now, we do elect our judges, which is a departure from the federal level. So those are going to be the main articles that we're going to be dealing with, but there are some additional articles. Article 6 deals specifically with suffrage, the right to vote, extending the right to vote to different individuals. Article 7 deals with public education, which also includes the university system within Texas. So that is going to, education is a state right, something that the states are primarily tasked with providing for their citizens, and so that is going to be outlined in Article 7. Articles 9 and 16 is some mundanity that establishes the county systems within the state, and there's some very rigid responsibilities and requirements of being a county in the state. And then Article 17 deals with amending the Constitution, and we will talk more about amending the Constitution as we move forward. It is something that happens all the time because it's a relatively easier process in Texas than it is at the federal level. So amending the Texas Constitution is not as complex as amending the federal Constitution, and so it happens a lot. The federal Constitution has been amended 27 times over the course of our 230 whatever years of history, and the Texas Constitution of 1876 that has been in place since 1876 has been amended like 400, 500, 600 times, somewhere in there. And again, I'll find that correct number as we start moving forward and looking at the that process. All right, so this is going to conclude your lecture series for this first unit, Unit 1. So I encourage you to go ahead and do the required reading, do the activity. There's going to be a couple of quizzes and an exam. So all of these are going to be due on the same day. Please check your calendar for that information. All right, thanks. See you soon.